Go Pizza presents SDP, the Steve Dangle Podcast, with your hosts, Steve Dangle, Adam Wylde, and Jesse Blake.
Let's go!
Okay, so best player of the last decade. And there's a lot of great players. A lot of great players. Who do you go with? Jesse Blake.
Easy peasy lemon squeezy, as they always say. I believe that was Barack Obama who invented that catchphrase. This man captained the Penguins to back-to-back Stanley Cups.
Mario Lemieux.
2016, 2017.
Ron Francis.
First team to repeat as champs in 20 years. Through 2016, he had won one Hart Trophy, one Art Ross, one Lester B. Pearson / Ted Lindsay. Nominated for another Hart, another Pearson. It was Sidney Crosby's decade.
Absolutely. It was absolutely
Argue
Sidney
with
Crosby's
that.
decade.
You can't.
Well, here, let me argue with it. My pick is Sidney Crosby. Also, he won 2 Stanley Cups this decade and another one to end out the previous one. He's very good in the back half of decades. But on top of, being the best player when he was healthy, the big story with him was his health, actually. And we sort of forget that. At the beginning of the decade, I want to say it was the 11-12 season where he got dinged. 11-12, he was on pace he was doing what McDavid and Draisaitl have been doing, where we talked about, they're going to hit 160 points, and now they've obviously cooled down. Well into this time of year, like into Christmas, into whenever the outdoor classic was, he was on pace for like 145 points. Just destroying everybody. Friggin' 4-point games, 3-point games, 5-point games, like all back to back. And CTE and concussions and all that, they've been such a big topic over the past decade. And I think a lot of it started with Sidney Crosby. You talk about a guy who can, in the middle of the regular season, get CBC to buy national broadcasting rights to a Pittsburgh Islanders game. Because that was his comeback game. One of his comebacks. Because he had several comebacks because of all the misdiagnosis. And sure enough, he scores. I think it might have even been his first shift coming back. Now, the Islanders were terrible back then. But everyone in Canada and I think the States watched that game because there aren't that many big-ticket items in the NHL, but one of them was, and always will be, Sidney Crosby.
Hard to disagree with any of that. Both of you make compelling arguments.
He's going to say friggin'
But you
Kadri.
have settled.
He's going to say Kessel.
For the guy who's won back-to-back cups,
You've
a couple
settled.
Hart trophies.
Because you've settled for a great generational hockey player.
The greatest
No,
of the last 10 years.
not the greatest.
Of the last 10 years.
The greatest is the greatest goal scorer in the history of the league, who is still currently playing.
Told you he was going to go with Kessel.
Alexander Ovechkin.
Oh, interesting.
Alexander Ovechkin is, for my
That's
money,
fascinating.
the best goal scorer of all time.
Yes.
You know, he doesn't have to beat Gretzky for me to believe that. Based on his era, based on how much the NHL has changed, based on what the 80s were, which were goofy.
Based on missing 2 years due to lockouts.
Yeah.
Alexander Ovechkin, like Crosby, generational great, and also partially I had him it was like a toss-up between, since you both took Crosby, I took Ovechkin. But Ovechkin, Crosby is great, and is on the Mount Rushmore of great hockey players all time, I think, right? Top 4, top 5, fair?
Yeah.
He's
Fair?
there.
Yeah.
Ovechkin on the goal-scoring Hall of Fame is number 1.
And you know what's
So you're-
amazing about that?
I'm right
His
there with you.
greatest individual goal-scoring season? Not this decade.
Yeah, right? Weird. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Especially because there was wasn't there less goals scored back then too?
Yep.
So this is a guy who has been, and sometimes rightly so, labeled as lazy or underperforming or can't get it done.
Celebrates with a stick on fire.
Yeah, well that I liked.
Yeah.
You know, didn't play defense, got benched by a coach, but he overcame all that and became the player that he needed to become. And it was so funny. I was watching an old Mike Milbury clip before this. And he was talking about, he's like, he's just standing there on the left side of the ice, waiting for a pass. What's he doing? Move around, get your ass to the boards. And it's funny because that's the only place he's ever scored goals from.
Right.
Is that one spot. And Milbury hated it at the time.
Bang and bang
And bang.
bang.
Alexander Ovechkin is not one of the greatest. He is the greatest goal scorer ever. And he is therefore the best player this decade.
Yeah. In terms of goals in the decade, the difference between him and second place, which is, I think, Stamkos, is the same as Stamkos and 15th place.
Wow.
He has over 460 goals this decade. No one else has cracked 400.
What's Stamkos at?
Somewhere below 400. I don't have the full numbers.
Honorable mentions.
God.
Honorable mentions. Evgeny Malkin, I think.
He's in there. Gino's in there.
Nathan McKinnon coming on strong at the end. Connor McDavid coming on strong at the end.
Yeah.
They have not played long enough to be considered in this decade.
If you think about the decades, those two guys, 1A, 1B, whichever way you want it.
Yep.
And you got to throw in a couple other positions, and people.
I couldn't think of a defenseman on that level.
And there's no goalie that's
No.
done it for.
There's
no goalie that did it for 10 years either.
Here's the problem.
Not for 10
yes,
years.
There is. Yes, there is, but he's never won a cup.
Lundqvist?
Henrik Lundqvist.
No.
Bobrovsky has the 2 Vezinas because he's had 2 Vezina seasons. He's also been very mediocre at times, and Lundqvist was never that. He was always in the top 5 conversation.
I think you got to win. Ovechkin got his in there.
2014. But you can't win it alone.
You got to win.
Yeah, I hope he wins a cup.
I was trying to think of defensemen that maybe could work in this, but I don't think there's a defenseman this decade who would rival what Crosby and Ovechkin did. You could make an argument previous decade for Nick Lidstrom. And in fact, I think you might say he was the best player that decade.
Easily. The guy I would say, or the 2 names I threw out for the Sportsnet all-decade team, I had Carlson on the right, and underrated because he didn't score as many points, but he does have a Conn Smythe trophy, is Duncan Keith. That guy plays half an hour a night, every night, and is just steady Eddie out
Did
there.
he dip too much at the end of this decade? Like, is the last 4 years of it, is it of quality?
Travis Yost was sort of beating this drum just last night.
Yeah.
Stop referring to the Chicago Blackhawks in the contention picture. They're bad. They're bad. So, I think part of the reason Duncan Keith was so good is he had a team behind him. But, he's not there are very few players in this league who are miracle workers. The Edmonton Oilers are another bad week away from potentially not being in a playoff spot. And McDavid's got a sidekick. Batman's got a Robin. And you need more than that. And when Keith was his best, he at least had a Robin. And that was Brett Seabrook. And now he doesn't even have that.
Yeah, fair enough.
The Steve Dangle Podcast. Follow the guys on Twitter at Steve_Dangle, at Adam WYLDE, and at Jesse Blake. Brought to you by Panago Pizza. Order at panago.com and stuff your face with deliciousness. Connection complete.